I'm Dara Cass. I'm an emergency physician and brand new faculty here at Brown. I didn't go here. I'm the only one on the stage that did not, but I pay the tuition because my daughter is a freshman. So, and really, I was aware of how magical this place was. Some of my best friends have gone here. Some of my best friends support the university. And now I get to work here and see just the talent that exists in this institution and has graduated from this institution to do incredible work. So this panel is going to be about what's happening right now on maternal and reproductive health care in America. And I'm actually not going to introduce the panelists, mostly because their introductions would take the whole time, and I want to get straight to the discussion. So if anybody speaks, feel free to Google them while they're speaking, and you'll learn a lot, including our first panelist that I'm going to speak to, Nancy Northrup. Nancy, according to Wikipedia, is a political activist, which is ironic because I wouldn't have used that as the first term to describe you, right? And because your legacy to me is about legal pragmatism and actually using the system that exists to ensure protection of rights and expand rights across the democracy and reproductive health care. And your current work at the Center for Reproductive Rights is legendary, to say the least. But I would love for you to open and talk a little bit about your work at the center, how you came to it, what you're dealing with now, domestic and international, and really kind of introduce the concept of what we're dealing with on maternal and reproductive health care in America.
It was me, I stole the notes.
Yeah, it's always the boss, by the way, that steals your notes. But anyway, so Nancy, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. And I also know that I've got something like 7.5 minutes, so I want to cover all those topics. Good morning. It's so good to see everyone here. I love the turnout for public health at 9 a.m. in the morning. So the Center for Reproductive Rights, our mission is to ensure that reproductive rights are protected in law as fundamental human rights around the world. And I always like to start saying that, reproductive rights it does not mean abortion only, and many people think that, it's a euphemism for abortion. It means the whole range of reproductive health issues throughout a person's life, from access to contraception, maternal health and pregnancy and childbirth, yes, safe and legal abortion, access to assisted reproduction like IVF. And we work not just in the U.S., but around the world. And I know we're going to talk about the U.S. today. But, I was thinking about, as you were introducing this panel between, clinicians and lawyers, that's true everywhere we work around the world, right? We're working with providers, we're working with public health people, and we're working with the law. Why? Because, first of all, there are very important clinical issues around reproductive health, and second, in so many places, the law gets in the way. But one thing I want to say before we turn to the United States is that to know that around access to abortion care, the rest of the world has moved forward in the last 30 years. 60 countries around the world have liberalized their abortion laws, and only 4 countries have regressed, moved backwards. And those 4 countries are the United States, Poland, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. So what happened in the United States in the Dobbs case almost 4 years ago is really extraordinary in terms of going backward. My organization argued the Dobbs case in the Supreme Court, and what the court did there was the biggest setback for women's rights in U.S. history, just period, full stop. Because what we're dealing with now in America is we're really living in 2 Americas. I mean, to say that the United States went backwards is not exactly accurate. It's to say that the Supreme Court went backwards and opened the door for a lot of states to do the same. And why I say 2 Americas is we now have states that have complete and total bans on abortion. Many also have restrictions very early on in pregnancy. And in those states, it's just a fundamental fact that women and pregnant people do not have control over their bodies. I mean, that is a fundamental freedom issue. And in other states, people still are free to make those decisions about their health, lives, and futures. And at the Center for Reproductive Rights, we've been working in both Americas, really pushing back against restrictions in states, and then also in other states, what is, perhaps unanticipated, is that there are stronger protections for access to reproductive health care. I mean, since the Supreme Court reversed Roe versus Wade, many voters in states that allow citizens to go to the ballot and put constitutional amendments on for them to decide have done so, and in states that surprise people. Michigan, Ohio, Missouri, Arizona, Montana, as well as states that you might expect it because they always had fulsome policies like California and Vermont. And in those states, voters put in their constitution, no state before Roe versus Wade was overturned had provisions in their constitution which now say, like in Arizona, it now says that individuals have a fundamental right to abortion. And in Michigan, right, that is a great thing. And in Michigan, for example, it's even broader. It talks about a whole range of reproductive freedoms, including for maternal health and other forms of reproductive health care. So we have this situation where, part of the country has become quite restrictive in really troubling ways. I mean, the penalty for abortion in the state of Texas is up to life in prison. And that means that there are just enormous pressures on doctors and nurses they have exceptions in the Texas law that are really impossible to access. We litigated on behalf of people who had obstetric complications in their pregnancy, and ultimately the Texas Supreme Court did nothing, and it's very troubling and difficult. So what I think I want to sort of close with is just to say that it is important that people think about, which is why it's so wonderful to have clinicians here, just the whole range of reproductive health care. I think about our lead plaintiff in the Texas case was a woman named Amanda Zarowski, and she struggled for years with infertility issues. She eventually was able to become pregnant through IVF, but then in 17 weeks into her pregnancy, she lost all of her amniotic fluid. And of course, that's something that no pregnancy can survive. But she was denied what she needed clinically, which was an abortion, and she was sent home until she developed sepsis. And she wound up in the emergency room in the ICU for 3 days, fighting for her life. Her family's coming in from around the country. And so ultimately, her story, and she survived, but I will say her fertility did not. The scarring from the infection has made it impossible for her to now conceive. And so, her story is one of the struggles with infertility. Her story is one of pregnancy and maternal health, and her story is one of needing access to abortion care. So looking at all these issues together is really critical. But with that, I'm going to let us get to the rest of the panel.
And we're going to come back to you. We're getting back to you. Don't you worry. Thank you. Actually, the next person we're going to talk to is Dr. Neil Shah. So Neil is a graduate of the undergraduate and the medical school here at Brown. And your work in maternal health, innovative maternal health, I would say, has been extraordinary, both before you joined Maven, actually, and now as the CMO of Maven. But the maternal health crisis in America is worsening with these abortion bans, but not just because of these abortion bans. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about what's going on with the spectrum of maternal health in America, what you see on the ground, what you see through your work at a telehealth organization that's expanding access to reproductive health care everywhere, and just really kind of like how you feel like, where you feel we are and where we're going with access to care, especially as we lose care in places like rural America and as hospitals close.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dara. So honored to be part of this panel, and I want to start by just making a note of all the men in this room, which is always great to see because these are issues that affect all of us. And as Nancy described so well, maternal care and abortion care and fertility care are all inextricable. But I see maternal health as a bellwether. When moms are unwell, society is unwell. When society is unwell, moms are unwell. And that's why almost every social justice issue shows up in maternal health, whether it's gender inequity or racial inequity or geographic inequity to the point on Two Americas, or even generational inequity. Make America great again. And I don't know what the slogan was in the last campaign. I don't think anybody does. But the prior one was Build Back Better, right? But both were kind of tapping into this idea that opportunity in our country is eroding. And there are real empirical signs of that, including the fact that moms today are more likely to die in childbirth than their own mothers were. It is more dangerous, more economically disempowering, more socially isolating to have a baby in America today than it was a generation ago, objectively. And so that's what we're dealing with. Since the 1970s, maternal mortality has gone up by 50%. Meanwhile, there's been gains for neonatal morbidity and mortality for extremely premature infants, but not term infants. And for those results, we actually intervened 500% more. Our C-section rate has gone up by 500%. And all of those numbers are the tip of an iceberg, because for every death, there's 100 cases of morbidity, which is like injury, and probably thousands of cases of suffering from avoidable illnesses and things like that. So that sounds really bad. But those are all lagging indicators. And I guess what I would want to contribute from maybe my seat at Maven, Maven takes care of 27 million people around the world. And many, many people in the United States. And it's sort of like sitting in the panopticon, which is a word that I did not know until I went to Brown. But you're like looking out over all these different sectors of the American economy. And one of our clients, for example, is Amazon. And Amazon has a baby every 12 minutes somewhere in Maharashtra, India, or Athens, Georgia. And 80% of them are fulfillment workers in warehouses. And they're actually, folks who are economically disempowered and all that. And part of what we see is you absolutely cannot deliver a baby through a screen. So you need infrastructure in our country, which is, we're seeing rural hospitals close, we're seeing access go away. In fact, the farthest you have to drive in Kenya to get to a hospital that's qualified to deliver your baby is 3 hours. But I've been to parts of our country, like in the panhandle of Oklahoma, or parts of, Minnesota or Nebraska, where you actually have to drive farther. So that is a problem. And also, the optimistic part, the leading indicators that we have an opportunity to make things better is that what a time to be alive technologically. And I know that there's a lot of, let's call it like doomerism around like the technology moment that we live in. But from my seat in a technology company, just to give you like maybe 2 examples of where my hope and optimism comes from. Preeclampsia is a condition that's been a scourge on humanity. It's like described in ancient Egyptian texts. We've had no idea what it was and no ability. We've always been on our back foot. And as of this year, we can amplify free-floating fetal mRNA and detect it in people with no apparent risk factors months in advance. This thing that I'm wearing on my finger, turns out when I was on call in my hospital in Boston, I had no idea when people were going to go into labor. Like if there was a full moon, I'd be like, we're probably going to be busy tonight, but that's all I knew. And it turns out this ring can predict labor onset hours in advance. We can talk about that after if you want. But so if you're living in rural Nebraska, that could be a huge, it can even take a blood pressure, which is completely game-changing. For managing pregnancy. So I think that, and that's not even to get into the AI of it all. I think there's so much potential right now in a system that used to be very calcified. Because at the end of the day, policy is really important, the law is really important, but they're relatively blunt instruments compared to service delivery on the ground. And service delivery on the ground right now is in a moment of incredible innovation.
Thank you. I did not know the Oura Ring will help with delivery onset. As an emergency medicine doctor, I might start distributing them to all my pregnant patients in the emergency room, letting them know that they hopefully won't have to come and deliver in the ED. Because delivering a baby on a rolling stretcher is an experience I wish on only 2 people in this room that are fellow ER doctors, but not to anybody else. Okay, so now we're going to go to Kate Shaw. And I'm actually going to tell a story that I didn't plan on telling, but now has become more relevant. Do you remember the first time we spoke about medication abortion in your house? I'll tell you, okay, so it was book club. And I said to you, the thing I wanted from the next presidential administration, this was like 2019 or 2018, was I wanted to get rid of the REMS. And you were like, what's that? It was novel that nobody else knew what REMS were except for the few of us that had engaged with mifepristone. I said, there's this restriction on access to this medication that you use for medication abortion. And if we can get rid of it, it will make it so much easier to take care of American women and people that get pregnant. And you're like, oh, that seems really possible, or whatever it was. And over the past 6 years or 8 years since it's been this, we have talked a lot about REMS and mifepristone, and you have become a total expert on the legal implications of restricting mifepristone, most specifically around what happened at the Supreme Court in the past week. As one of the most entertaining, although even on your podcast, I don't know that you're the most entertaining of the three. I have a huge affinity for some of Melissa's accents. But I would love you to speak to what's happening with this court. What can we expect over the next year? What happened over the past month? And just leave us with a little optimism on... Just kidding.
No promises on that last part. I thought you were going to tell the story of when you texted me that you filed a brief, an amicus brief, in the U.S. Supreme Court in the latest effort to restrict access to mifepristone, and I texted back just LFG.
You did. That was what I told you. I was gonna talk about.
Which I do think that I didn't remember that first conversation, but Dara and I have been talking really since it was clear that the Supreme Court was fundamentally different and that, it was only a matter of when and not if Roe would fall, that lawyers and doctors needed to be in much more active conversation. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously true about public health officials. And anyway, what you all are doing here is really exciting and important, and we need to be out of our narrow kind of silos of expertise. And I think we are doing that, but we all need to do it much, much more. And I still am not really a REMS expert, but I do think that understanding the interplay between law and medicine is something that we are all, I think, aspiring to do, and it's an urgent task. Okay, so the latest attack on mifepristone, pretty quickly after Dobbs overruled Roe, the sights of anti-abortion forces were set on restricting access to mifepristone, which became, post-Dobbs, a key lifeline for pregnant individuals seeking to terminate pregnancies, in particular once the FDA loosened the restrictions on provision of medication abortion through telehealth, so without any in-person consultation requirement. That was an important step. It sort of happened in two phases. And that meant that it was, the sort of availability of mifepristone as part of the 2-drug protocol for ending early pregnancies, meant that there was a way to continue to get access to abortion care for early pregnancies in the post-Dobbs world. And that meant that, again, anti-abortion forces really targeted it. So the first big effort that made it to the Supreme Court was in 2024, so 2 years after Dobbs, in a case called Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine versus the FDA. This was a group of anti-abortion doctors and a couple of dentists. Who filed a lawsuit in a Texas court with a very sympathetic judge, sympathetic to their cause, and succeeded in convincing this judge to essentially declare mifepristone an unauthorized drug, full stop. That was partially overridden in the Court of Appeals in Texas, which didn't say no, mifepristone cannot lawfully be prescribed for this, but did purport to reinstitute these restrictions on telehealth and some other restrictions. And that case came up to the Supreme Court, and it is rare that I will say a nice thing about this Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court did the right thing in that case and said that these anti-abortion doctors and dentists did not have the legal right. They were not injured in a way that the law recognized that gave them the authority to be in court challenging this, access to this drug, or challenging the FDA's provisions for access to this drug. So that case was thrown out unanimously on standing grounds, but anti-abortion forces very quickly crafted a new strategy, which is to bring lawsuits on behalf of states that claim that the sort of loose regulations around accessing mifepristone made it impossible for them, these states, to enforce their abortion restrictions or prohibitions. So the state of Louisiana, basically convinced the lower courts that it had a right, even if these earlier plaintiffs didn't, to be in court, and that these loosened regulations permitting telehealth were unlawful. So that was successful in the lower courts, and the Supreme Court, once again, it sort of stopped clock maybe, but did do the right thing, at least in the short term, which is they put on hold what the Fifth Circuit had done, restoring access to mifepristone on the terms that it has now been available on for a number of years. But there were some very scary dissents in that case. So one from Justice Thomas, one from Justice Alito. Justice Thomas suggested reviving the Comstock Act, the 1873 statute that prohibits the mailing of basically obscene materials that has, there's been a theory that the provision of medication abortion and other, implements used in performing any sort of abortion could be understood to violate this clearly unconstitutional, but still on the books, 1873 statute. And so that was a very scary writing. And Justice Alito essentially accused in his separate dissent the FDA and blue states essentially of colluding to circumvent or evade their decision in Dobbs. Which is pretty strange, right? Dobbs said, we're going to overrule Roe and return abortion to the states and the people's elected representatives. But it's pretty clear that in Alito's mind, the kind of only democratically legitimate choice that states and voters can make in the wake of Dobbs is to restrict rather than permit access to abortion. So maybe I'll just say like two more things and then I'll wrap. I think that what Nancy was saying about the kind of state landscape post Dobbs is really important, and it is true that when voters have gone to the polls in the wake of Dobbs, in the vast majority of occasions, they have acted to expand access to abortion. But not every state has direct democracy mechanisms that allow people to vote statewide to amend their constitution or to pass statutes themselves without going through their legislatures. And so for a lot of people, in a lot of states, even where, and in most states there is majority support for access to abortion, there is no way to translate those desires directly into policy. And in this era of increasingly extreme gerrymandering, there is no way that gerrymandered state legislatures are going to allow the translation of people's preferences into policy. And the gerrymandering has everything to do with this Supreme Court. So I do think that when we think about the sort of connection between the Supreme Court and abortion, the decisions the court has handed down permitting this extreme gerrymandering, both partisan and now racial gerrymandering, including in the Louisiana versus Calais case, basically striking down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, those cases have acted to thwart democratic will. And so, I think that we sort of try to think about how big a problem the Supreme Court is in terms of the future of abortion access. There's the abortion cases, but there are also the democracy cases. And the democracy cases are also abortion cases. They have huge implications for the future of abortion policy. And then the last thing I'll say is elections for state judges and justices on high courts those are also critical to the future of abortion in essentially every state, because even states that have Missouri, for example, right, actually expanded access to abortion via ballot initiative, state courts are doing in sort of hostile states are doing everything in their power to thwart implementation of those laws. And so that, I think, is another critical site that we may not pay enough attention to. So I'll wrap there.
So actually, that's a plug for two things. So one is one of our policy briefs on the stage, if anyone's interested, is on the restriction of mifepristone, misoprostol, which are the two medications used in medication abortion, and methotrexate, which if anyone knows anybody that's ever had an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy outside of really an implantable area of the uterus, that's the medication used for that. It's also used for like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. States like Louisiana and South Carolina and Missouri are trying to restrict that medication as a controlled substance, which really impacts access to that medication for patients that have nothing to do with abortion services, because those states also make abortion illegal. So if you want to know more about that and what's happened at the states and then what to look out for, I want to thank also specifically folks at CRR and Reproductive Futures for reviewing a lot of our briefs as we've put them out. We've had incredible partners in making sure that they're inclusive of all perspectives across the spectrum of advocacy, medical, legal partnerships. I'm actually going to switch a little bit of the lineup from what I warned. So Kima, you're on deck. But Emma, the reason I want to bring you in next is you are obviously the most recent graduate here, and you've done work at the ACLU and Pregnancy Justice, which will bridge a lot of our equity conversations and our brief on cannabis and pregnancy. But I want to talk a little bit about shield laws, because Kate opened the door to talk about this offense that Sam Alito had in his dissent, which was that this coordination of blue states and the FDA to insert their will into states that desperately want to restrict access to abortion. And he hates shield laws so much, but this case is not actually about shield laws. And so he's using every opportunity he can to undermine access through telehealth. Can you talk a little bit about your work at Reproductive Futures and what shield laws are and what you guys are working on right now?
Sure, and it's an incredible honor to be here among these co-panelists. And I would not say it's obvious that I am the youngest graduate on the panel. But I found myself feeling sort of hopeful and kind of honored and proud reading Alito's dissent.
He was so pissed.
Yes, his just visceral anger jumped off of the page. And you know that you are doing something right when you make Sam Alito that angry. And the truth is, as Neil said, the past few years have been a time of enormous innovation across both law and medicine and public health. And so while we've had the rise of telemedicine and the vast expansion of access to patients living in rural areas, we've also created this legal infrastructure that has made possible the delivery of telemedicine and abortion medication to patients who would otherwise find it completely out of reach. So SHIELD laws are laws that exist now in 18 states. 8 of those 18 have laws that explicitly protect telemedicine. And they are protections for providers, such that if a hostile red state either files a criminal action or a civil action against the provider, then the blue state will refuse to participate in that legal investigation or that legal action, and they will refuse to extradite the provider. So this is a strategy that was actually first crafted by 3 law professors. Academics really do practical things. And they were enacted shortly after Dobbs, starting in 2022, and since that time, we've been back at the legislature every single year trying to amend them and update them in response to the newest tactics that these anti-abortion states have brought. So thus far, we've seen civil actions out of the state of Texas, as well as criminal actions out of the state of Louisiana, against providers in New York and California. In both those instances, the governors stood up and said, I will not, under any circumstance, extradite this provider. One of those governors actually used some expletives when making that statement, so that was fun.
Not my governor.
Yes. Thus far, it's really working. And so as a result, roughly 2/3 of abortions now are done via medication abortion rather than in clinic procedural abortion, and 1/4 of all abortions are done via telemedicine. And as a result, the number of abortions nationwide has actually gone up rather than down since the Dobbs decision. And so that's what's making Sam Alito and his friends so very angry. And right now, while this latest case, Louisiana versus FDA, it effectively paused the Fifth Circuit ruling that would have otherwise reinstated the requirement that patients go in person to a clinic in order to access abortion. The case is going to be back up at the Supreme Court, within the next few months. By early next year, it will be back there. And so this is sort of a temporary reprieve. And what's critical is that people really speak out about how essential this access is. The court is very smart. They know that the midterms are coming. They know that abortion is so incredibly popular that voters would be outraged if they took that right away right now through telemedicine. And the Trump administration really wants to have it both ways. They want to appease the anti-abortion activists who are so critical to their party while also not being held responsible for eliminating the right. And so we can expect that this issue will be, once again, making headlines after the midterm elections. And I think this is the most important moment to keep speaking out about it, keep it in the news, keep talking about why medication abortion via telemedicine is safe and effective and legal, and how if we take it away, people will be not only furious and hold politicians and courts responsible, but also it will really jeopardize lives, and it will endanger people all across the country.
And that is something that I think, highlighting the opportunity for the lab at Brown, one of the things we're doing as we write our policy briefs is thinking about the moment in the media, the moment in messaging, policy, politics, to ensure that the right information is out there. So ensuring that we write a policy brief on telehealth access and what it means for equity for patients who are in rural America, for patients who otherwise wouldn't have access to care, is critically important as voters, stakeholders, and politicians and legislators actually think about the impact of their decisions. So now, Kima, I'm going to bring it to you as a fellow physician also, but you're plebe, so you were way smarter than me getting into medical school as a high school student. I wanted to talk a lot about your work on equity and access to care. It's one of the things that we talk a lot about, especially as we talk about abortion and access, is the idea that telehealth and traveling is possible, but we know that healthcare is actually local, right? And that if your healthcare locally does not serve you, then you are at risk higher than anybody else. We're seeing data that shows that although abortions may not be going down, it is less safe to be pregnant in America than ever before, especially for having a pregnancy emergency. And your work at the Commonwealth Fund and in Baltimore, and now as a consultant, really kind of informs how can we improve access, equitable access to healthcare right now, but what do we need to think about? And I really do want you to talk about harm reduction, because it's one of the pillars of our lab, but it's one that we don't talk about a lot, especially as it intersects with criminalization of people who are pregnant. So please, that's a lot for the next 4 minutes. Please, thank you.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I think I'm going to back it up and then move forward, but I'm a pediatrician by training, worked in FQHC when I was growing up. But also, I would say, but I do a lot of work around drug policy, expanding access to and redefining substance use services, and I say that redefining because it needs to include harm reduction. We do harm reduction for every other chronic disease we take care of, but oh my gosh, substance use, and it's a big lightning rod. So expanding out, getting it paid for, and then also pulling them out of punitive systems, including child welfare, criminal legal systems, and others. So just like Don Quixote all over. But in that work, and I think even in the panel that we're talking about here, one, people don't care about equity. They use the word, I'm not sure they know what it means. And so for me, when I think of equity, it's not just equitable access. You can get access in the healthcare system, go through the wood chipper. It is equitable outcomes for everyone in the population, regardless of their demographics. And I was at this meeting where someone's like, a national meeting, where a national leader of an organization said, oh, but talking about equity now is so hard. And I was taken back to, I'm aging myself, but no offense, the audience looks like they're similar. But there was this time.
No offense to the audience.
When this
We're happy to have you.
came out, and the Barbie said, math is hard. And it was like, and it wasn't just the fact that you had this Barbie saying that nonsense, but they went through all the different pieces of manufacturing, creation, and actually made it to the table that could come out. And that's what I feel about when people are like, equity is hard. It's like, that went through your whole organization and that came out your mouth. And as an American descendant of slaves, and my folks grew up in the segregated South, like, they made great strains without using that word. So I think we can still do it. And it really requires us to be honest. And I'm going to end mine with three things. It requires us to be honest. It requires us to talk to and with and listen to and with communities. And it really requires us to admit that the ground is poison. And that's going to require us to have broader and more durable relationships and collaborations, even beside clinicians and lawyers. They don't like us. As a Black woman, and the 92%, I know it's not just that they don't want me to have an abortion. It's not just that, okay, your maternal child health outcomes kind of suck and we're going to go on our merry way. Like, the whole ground is poison. Education, hospitals, employment, look how many. And what worries me in this space is they don't like women. There is deep misogyny in this space. And we can talk about these pieces, but unless we have really broader conversations, broader coalitions, again, with education, with people of all colors, it's not just rural equity and non-rural equity. People don't have access in urban areas. They don't have access to quality in rural areas because we're always talking about access. What about those outcomes? They're not healthy. I do a lot of work, like I said, around pregnancy criminalization. I do expert witness, all this. You can have a really great court case, but if at the end of the day that person comes out of that court case and still goes to the wood chipper 3 months later because of their pediatrician or because of the healthcare system, we haven't done our job. So I say that to say, I really do think one way we can incorporate equity in some of these conversations is you have to have diverse people at the table. And I say that in terms of, like I said, I focus on substance use. A lot of time we do these things, and we do the cases where the person had a poppy seed bagel, so they were really innocent. We do the things where if we have a white woman who uses drugs, then people feel more sympathetic. It's really hard when it's a black woman because they take her down. Yeah, we know. And so you still have to do it. And you have to make sure it's with someone who's okay with going through a hard time, but you need to see the different faces because we need to change the conversation. We need to say we actually deserve to have care. We actually deserve to have positive outcomes. We are human. Like, I am 56 years old. Why do I have to keep reminding people of that, right? We deserve all the same things everyone else does. So we have to have diversity in the cases we bring. We have to have an inclusive vision, which requires we talk to everyone and listen. I'm a provider. Love lawyers, have lawyers in the families, but we're not the best listeners, right? We got ideas. Like girlfriend was saying, 3 doctors for academics came out. Yes, that's important. But communities, I always say, like Black and Indigenous communities, which have really poor maternal child health and other outcomes, like they've been trying to take us out for ages and we're still here. We know stuff, right? Listen. Take the time to listen and utilize those tools because we need them more than ever. And I would say also as a researcher, I worked at Urban Institute for years, and outcomes, being able to assess and stratify the outcomes and make sure they're relevant outcomes. As a doc, we always do HEDIS measures. That does not say anything about whether you're well, right? They need to be relevant outcomes, not just about how healthcare is working, but how our health is. As a Black woman, I deserve to be well. Not just my womb. I'm actually more than my womb. I'm a whole person. My child is a whole person. We deserve to be well, and what do those metrics look like to see if we're getting there? And if we're not getting there, it doesn't mean like everything failed. It means we have to tweak things and work to get there. And that is inclusive of reproductive rights, but it sits in a broader setting of they don't like us. Like, there are people in charge who have rape charges. They do not like us. So how do we create a tank where we actually have the possibility to be well, and if we're not, demand it?
Thank you. I just want to pause on that, right? I think the way that you framed it, right, like harm reduction, impact, like that is why we felt there was a place at the table for this lab in the moment. There's a lot of people that for years have been doing incredible work on reproductive health care and continue to do so. But one of the urgencies that I felt on the ground in the emergency department and talking to so many of my friends was that we wanted to kind of, like Liz always uses the words that I always forget, we're synthesizing. I don't know why I can't hold on to that word. Synthesizing the research that exists already, right? There's a lot of great research out there. We know so much, like Kima says, we know so much about how to save lives. We're just not doing it. Can we do more to translate that knowledge into impact, into action, so that legislators, people, voters, stakeholders, whoever you are, can do more where you live? Even if you live in a state like Louisiana, which is very excited about restricting access for as many people as possible in many, many creative ways, which includes, the last brief I will pitch to you is the one on unregulated pregnancy centers that's on the table. I don't know how many of you know about crisis pregnancy centers. We don't have time to talk about it here, but they are not healthcare facilities. They are not staffed by healthcare providers. They divert people who are looking for access to information and abortion services. And most importantly, they are now center of the federal website called moms.gov, next to, but before, federally qualified health centers that are actual health centers. So prioritizing misinformation and distraction before actual health care seems to be a priority of that website, which again, for us, is about information, telling people what they are and ensuring they understand that they now receive enormous amounts and even more federal funds, taking away from what is called temporary assistance for needy families, which are cash dollars for people who are low income that need support to support their children. So the last thing we're going to end with, because of course we're going over, because that's what I knew before we started. I want to just go down and I want you guys to reflect on your time at Brown, because I think this is a magical place. As a late comer to Brown, but realizing, what about your experience here informed your role in this world? We're going to start with Neil and end with Nancy, who has more than one degree, but most recently an honorary from Brown. And talk about just a couple of minutes of your time here, how it informed your journey in reproductive health care, maternal health, and just any nuggets you want the group to leave with. Neil, you're up first.
Okay, Brown is a magical place. I'll say I was here at the medical school, and as a man in my mid-20s, this is the last thing I thought I'd be doing for a living. But there's no better training than Women and Infants Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. As people don't know, this is one of the busiest labor and delivery units in the country by far. And it was my first week of medical school to get it over with. And by the end of that first week, it was pretty clear, like, how could I do anything else? I'll also say I didn't arrive at college here at Brown deeply passionate about this issue, but I had many friends who did, including Ariana Green, who connected me to you, which is why I'm on this panel.
Who's in book club? It's a really good book club.
It sounds like it, yeah. But from day one, and so I think I learned as much from my friends at Brown as I did from the classroom, and probably more.
So I think it is the greatest blessing for anybody who aspires to work in law or policy that Brown does not have a law school, because there was no such thing as a pre-law track. It meant that I had the freedom to just have intellectual curiosity and take classes that interested me and inspired me. And it didn't really matter what I majored in. I mean, I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer working in reproductive rights and justice, but at the end of the day, my Brown education just taught me to be curious about people, to be curious about issues, and to think creatively. So to study across disciplines, and I think Brown's greatest assets really is its students and its community, and I think more than anything, the conversations I had late at night in the Rock and all of that just taught me to find common empathy and humanity with all different kinds of people.
I agree with everything that's just been said. I'll add, I was a double major, but one of my majors here was gender studies. I think it's now gender and sexuality studies. And as Brown folks know, it doesn't actually matter that much because you take classes, in lots of different subjects. But I do think that the focus on gender and gender as a critical lens has been something that I brought with me to law school. Not all my academic work is on repro at all. I write about the presidency, I write about the Supreme Court. But I think the kind of the sort of critical lens tools, sort of thinking experience, and actual practice that you get as a Brown student, I think has informed basically everything I have done since, and the things I've learned not just from my professors or in the classroom, but from the really incredible classmates that I had. A couple of them are here this morning. All of that, I think, has just had everything to do with the kind of trajectory of my career since. So I remain really, really grateful.
Yeah, I want to echo, and particularly Emma's. I was a Portuguese Brazilian studies major, and being in the PLME allowed me to do that, allowed me to study abroad in Salvador, Bahia, and then go to med school, which was a rude awakening at first, but nonetheless. But I think what that did, and my main mentor was my Portuguese Brazilian studies mentor all through med school. That was the person who's like, you can do this, you got this, and that experience that you've had is going to make you a better provider. And I will say, definitely holding all of those viewpoints and that ability that you can do this means, just to give you a sense of the jobs I've had, I've been a pediatrician, I worked in the Hill for Senator Sarbanes, I worked as a researcher, I worked for a foundation, worked and now as a consultant. I was Deputy Health Commissioner of Baltimore City. All of those, bringing that perspective that these are all relevant to the fights that we want to have. Having all of the people at the table are going to be important and relevant for us to really see equitable outcomes in this country. And Brown makes you realize that there are not voices that you can leave at the table. You always know someone's missing, and you should go find them.
Well, rounding out, I would say that my classmates, my academic studies, there was a full year course by Professor Ed Beiser called The Politics of the Legal System. And although there was no pre-law track, everybody who's thinking about law school was in that class, but it helped us look at the bigger picture around these cases in terms of what was happening with society. And I was also thinking, your comment about let's pull way back and think about what's going on. When I entered Brown in 1977, there wasn't one woman serving in the United States Senate. So it was, and the only professors that I had who were women were those that were teaching women's history. There was no big gender focus then. That was all that was available. But here's what I will say that hasn't been mentioned. So Brown is in Providence, which is the capital of the state of Rhode Island. So I guess I did become a political activist when I was at Brown, because I did my first lobbying on abortion rights by walking down to the state capitol and working with the Rhode Island Women's Political Caucus. So it's an opportunity to always get involved in the state politics, because it's such a small state and you can just dive right in.
Thank you. We were going to take questions. I think instead what we'll do is invite you all to our little reception afterwards, if that's okay. Denise, is that okay? To our reception outside, we have coffee, some snacks. As many of our panelists can stay as possible. Please take our policy briefs and read them when you get a chance. They're really good. They're also going to be available on our AIM website. I want to thank our panelists, all of whom I consider a friend, both before and now, for an incredible conversation.